everybody, and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Judah Grunstein, WPR's editor-in-chief, and I'm joined by WPR associate editors Elliot Waldman. Hi, Elliot.
Hey, Judah.
And Prachi Vidwans. Hi, Prachi.
Hi, Judah.
We'll be talking about the European Union's historic budget agreement this week, as well as the escalating tensions between the U.S. and China. Before we get started, just a quick reminder for everyone listening that the interview episode of the podcast went live Wednesday. Elliot spoke with Adriana Beltran about the latest attacks on the rule of law in Guatemala, where a backlash against an anti-corruption campaign is coming to a head. Also, a quick heads up that we'll be putting the editor's discussion on hold until the beginning of September due to a bunch of upcoming vacations and our reduced publishing week in August. We'll be trying to come up with some ideas to improve the format over that time, so if you have any suggestions, feel free to email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Elliot, Prachi, this week we saw the European Union, after 4 acrimonious days of debate and discussion, finally agree to their 7-year budget plan, which included a historic agreement for the first time to authorize collective debt, part of which would be awarded as grants to countries that have suffered the worst of the brunt of the coronavirus pandemic. The rest would be in the form of repayable loans. But historic in the sense that it's the first time that kind of collective debt arrangement had ever been approved by the EU. Elliot, at the same time, the deal still faces some opposition and perhaps some hurdles before it's finalized.
Yes, very much so. I mean, on one sense, this was still a notable accomplishment, right? The EU did need this deal. It would have sent a chill through financial markets if it hadn't reached a deal. It also just would have been a big reputational blow to Brussels if talks had fallen apart. But as you mentioned, there were still a lot of painful concessions that were made, despite a lot of support from member states, and the need for consensus among all 27 members made it pretty difficult to make everyone happy. A lot of European Parliament members are speaking out already. The European Parliament needs to approve the deal before it can be implemented. Some of them are even saying they would prefer to not have a deal and just continue on with current levels of funding in the existing EU budget. There's also a lot of opposition from green parties across the continent, far-right parties, the National Rally in France, the Alternative for Germany. These parties have expressed vehement opposition to the deal and will probably put up a pretty stiff fight during domestic debates over ratification as they try to chip away at centrist parties' support, I think.
And a lot of that opposition is based in some of the compromises and concessions that were made mainly to get this collective debt agreement across the line. So there was EU defense spending was ended up about half of what was initially proposed, from I think 15 billion euros to something around 7 or 9. There were cuts to research. There was cuts to foreign aid. Cuts to some of the commitments to the European Green Deal. That was such a big part of the European Commission's platform last year. And so a lot of opposition on the part of the Green parties, as you mentioned, a lot of opposition among populist parties because of this idea that the wealthy European countries will be bailing out the irresponsible ones. But I think that really what made it so urgent, and maybe what made it politically possible, was the fact that it was the coronavirus pandemic that was at the heart of that collective debt deal, something that couldn't be controlled, something that really doesn't have to do with fiscal responsibility or not, and something that would have been a real blow to European solidarity, to the countries that really did suffer the biggest brunt and would have the hardest time financing some of the things that are required in terms of the economic fallout on sovereign debt markets. So I think that's really what pushed it through. But again, as you mentioned, Elliot, it will leave a lot of exposure to some of those populist parties that oppose the EU in principle, and will have a lot to use for cannon fodder in domestic political debates. Prachi, there were also some implications for rule of law in the EU because initially there was very strong proposals for conditioning any grants or loans on respect for the rule of law. And the EU norms around that. And those were watered down to the point where basically it's been accused of just being window dressing in order to make sure that the vote at the end was unanimous.
Right. So I think this deal, as you said, is quite historic. It affirms the value of the EU project. It's a great show of solidarity. At the same time, analysts have pointed out that it previews some of the battles to come. And one of those things is the rule of law issue. It's kind of ambiguous. It seems that the way it was written still leaves the door open for the grants to be conditioned on rule of law to an extent, but it's written so ambiguously that essentially both sides of that debate are claiming victory. So the Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, was quoted as saying that Viktor Orbán, the Hungarian Prime Minister, now presents it as a great victory because all kinds of words that were in it that he didn't like are no longer there. But the core is there. The core is there. I'm really going to hold that up. So it seems like these debates are only going to continue and that this issue might become more and more contentious. At the same time, I think talking about EU principles and what the EU stands for can sometimes seem abstract, but some are speculating that this rule of law decision will have some immediate domestic impacts in countries like Poland and Hungary, where the rule of law is under threat. So, for example, the New York Times mentioned that this might embolden Poland to pursue some restrictions on the press and judicial independence because now they don't need to worry about backlash from the EU in terms of funding. And, both countries have some elections coming up in 2022, 2023. So if the economy does recover because of this funding, that'll be seen as a great victory for these ruling parties and could have these domestic consequences as well.
There were also issues of oversight and transparency because of the tendency of some of these governments in Central and Eastern Europe that tend to like to attack the EU in principle and make it sort of a scapegoat for a lot of their domestic problems, but also like a lot of the funding that comes from the EU, which has a tendency to sometimes disappear into people's pockets instead of into the projects that they're earmarked for. That too was watered down. Instead of having a veto, the European Commission gets oversight, or rather, each country has to submit a plan for what the money is going to be spent on, and there's some comment period that the Commission can give feedback for on those plans. But in general, the deal, to my mind, demonstrated or sort of highlighted this the balance of power within the EU and the way in which it's shifting. There's historically been this idea that when France and Germany get behind something, they can really push it through. And they did in this case. France and Germany were really, and particularly France, Emmanuel Macron, the president, really put a lot of political capital into this. And he convinced Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, to change her position. And once she started supporting it, it became possible. At the same time, it showed how the coalition of smaller states, they're known as the Frugal Four: Netherlands, Austria, Denmark, and Sweden, really pushed back. They didn't torpedo the deal, but they got quite a bit of concessions, often for domestic purposes, just to be able to show domestic audiences that they fought for positions that are more popular back home. But it also showed a lot of the divisions within Europe, not only between the North and the South, in terms of the wealthier countries and the countries that are not only wealthy, but the more fiscally responsible countries of the North and the South, where there's more problem with debt and budget deficits, but also the East-West divide which Prachi, you mentioned, had to do in part with the rule of law. But there are also issues in terms of security priorities with regard to Russia or the Mediterranean, which takes priority. So as much as it was a real victory for the EU and historic, it demonstrates also the fault lines and the fragility, I think, of the kind of consensus that emerged.
I would agree with that. I think the Franco-German alliance that you touched on, Judah, is important to note, especially in this post-Brexit EU, where the center of political gravity increasingly seems to be with the Paris-Berlin axis, right? Continental Europe's two largest economies taking the lead, but they are still just 2 out of 27 members. And in this consensus-based decision-making that's required for this budget deal, there were a lot of soft targets for cuts. You mentioned research, spending on health, foreign aid, things like the Erasmus program, which supports foreign exchange students going to different countries around the EU. These are things that play a very important role in forging a more long-term strategy for the EU and building a base of human capital that supports future economic growth. So I think it's a pretty short-sighted budget, all things considered.
There's also something with regard to the EU and Europe in general that remains just a real prominent challenge, and it has to do with identity and European identity. In a way, the sacrifices that were made really underscore that. The Erasmus program, for instance, where you have young people at a really formative age that are going to different countries and studying there and making relationships, and that really represented an early effort by the European Union to promote the formation and the emergence of a European identity. And in a lot of ways over the past 10, 15 years, that's failed. There's been a resurgence of nationalism, the kind of fault lines that I talked about, but there just hasn't been the emergence of a European identity in the same way that, for instance, in the United States, you have an American identity, even if someone happens to live in New York State or California. Texas might be one exception where there's a really strong state identity. But for the most part, people are American first and anything else second. And in Europe, it still hasn't reached that. And it makes these kinds of political compromises, not that they're easy in the U.S. these days, but it makes these kinds of gestures of solidarity that much more important, but also that much more difficult. I think also the thing that comes out of this, Elliot, you mentioned the cuts to healthcare, for instance, and EU defense, which I mentioned. There's been this push in the EU over the past year or so, this idea of strategic autonomy, this idea of getting a little tougher on China, this idea that the EU has to be more than what Hubert Védrine, a former French foreign minister, often calls a big giant Switzerland, where there has to be some sort of strategic and hard power approach to international affairs. That's become really important over the past 5-10 years in terms of protecting European populations from financial crises, from the impact of geopolitical events and wars in the Mediterranean region, and now in terms of health and from global pandemics. And this idea of a Europe that protects was a real prominent feature of, for instance, Emmanuel Macron's discourse on Europe. And it seems like this deal cuts a lot of the things that would really allow European leaders to point to the ways in which the EU protects Europeans and domestic voters. And so it will weaken the ability to push back against the populist party's attacks on the EU as just being a waste of money and an erosion of sovereignty. And so I think I agree with you. It's not very strategic and it's not very long-sighted. There's not a lot of foresight involved in some of the concessions that were made. So again, a historic achievement, but with quite a bit of downside to get it. Prachi, any final thoughts before we move on to the second topic?
I guess what comes up for me is this tension between solidarity towards that European identity that you mentioned versus sovereignty. And I think that after Brexit, it is really important and difficult to negotiate what this European identity is after such a big player has abandoned it. So I'd be interested to see how this plays out, especially, domestically, are within France, within Germany, within many of the other countries that we've mentioned. Is there this desire from publics to sustain the European identity at a moment when it could be a powerful uniting factor?
From everything I've seen in terms of public opinion polling in Europe, the European Union is kind of the equivalent of Obamacare in the United States. When you look at the polling on Obamacare, if you poll individual planks of the program, most people predominantly support the individual planks. When you then globally frame it as Obamacare and ask them what they think, it's much less popular. I don't know if it's majority against or majority for, but it's much less popular than the individual planks. And the EU is similar. When the questions posed have to do with individual aspects or particular aspects of the EU and what it accomplishes, most people are really for it. It varies from country to country, but it remains relatively popular. But then if you frame it as the EU overall, it's a lot easier to criticize and attack. And so that question of solidarity and sovereignty sometimes comes down to which side of the problem and which side of the equation you approach it from. But I do think that until the EU solves the problem of how it can sell itself as a protector of European populations in a world that's becoming more competitive and more conflictual in some ways, it's going to have trouble maintaining popular support and on the domestic level, but also on the EU level. Elliot, anything you wanted to add?
I think some of this gets down to fundamental aspects of the way the EU is structured. And I think we've talked about this in previous episodes of the show, which is there's just this consistent lack of trust or feeling of resentment among a lot of people across Europe that their lives are being dictated to them, or aspects of their lives are being dictated to them by elites in Brussels. And I think you've mentioned before, Judah, that people generally prefer to have their elites closer at hand, right? They, like someone in the Czech Republic would prefer to be dictated to by an elite in Prague rather than an elite in Brussels. So that just opens up this tremendous opportunity for scapegoating of these right-wing populist parties across the continent, many of which are actually led by elites themselves, but they see an opportunity to scapegoat Brussels for all of their problems, and that tends to carry a lot of political weight.
Agreed. And significantly, a lot of those populist parties have toned down their desire to leave the EU. They still like to use it as a whipping boy for, as you said, to scapegoat and to avoid responsibility for domestic problems and issues. But it seems as if more recently the goal has been to try to control and co-opt the EU from the inside, rather than leave it. I'll be very interested to see, with regard to these parties and the opposition to this deal that you mentioned, Elliot, how that evolves over time. Because if this program comes through and if this money starts being distributed, it stands to make a big difference in some of these countries in a way that didn't happen during the European debt crisis. And so it's possible that there will be much less bitterness and much less resentment about the way in which bailouts are distributed. So I'm curious to see how that evolves, whether their position on it evolves and whether their support erodes because of the positive impact of this program, if it's finally and definitively approved and implemented. All right, moving on to our second topic, the escalation in tensions between the U.S. and China. We saw a dramatic move this week with the U.S. giving China 72 hours to close and evacuate its consulate in Houston. Elliot, when the news came out that evening, I saw reports that a bonfire had been spotted in the courtyard of the Houston consulate. Apparently, something of a document dump in Houston. Something that surprises you, or to be expected?
No, I'd say it's to be expected. Getting rid of sensitive documents, destroying them in that way is pretty much standard operating procedure when a diplomatic facility is ordered to close with such short notice. It just means that you don't want to leave anything behind, some sensitive information, classified national secrets for any U.S. officials to discuss after they take control of that space again. But I think the larger question here is really one of strategy, or the lack thereof, right? Because there doesn't really seem to be any rhyme or reason behind this decision that the Trump administration suddenly announced. There was no sense that we got from any of the U.S. officials who were briefing reporters, at least that I saw, that the U.S. had pressed China on the grievances that it was expressing to try to get them to change their behavior before taking this extremely escalatory step. So it kind of conveys the sense that this was done prematurely and without a real exit strategy in mind or an off-ramp to de-escalate. And this is going to have repercussions, right? China has said it will retaliate. There's going to be a closure of a similarly sized U.S. consulate in China. So far, the candidates seem to be the consulate in Wuhan, which the U.S. evacuated earlier this year due to the coronavirus pandemic that started in Wuhan. It's not really clear whether that consulate is back up and running yet. But more consequentially, China could decide to close the U.S. consulate in Chengdu, which is the closest one to Tibet and has pretty important strategic implications for the U.S. So this is not a cost-free move, and yet it seems to have been undertaken with a lack of overarching strategy.
It follows a bunch of moves to sanction Chinese officials for the national security law in Hong Kong, as well as the human rights abuses in Xinjiang. Frida Gittes this week in her column talked about some sanctions that were unveiled because of moves in Tibet. But again, as you said, Elliot, it does seem to be all sort of knee-jerk, clutching for straws, not very well coordinated and rolled out in a way where the impact is more surprise than understanding. At the same time, Prachi, China isn't exactly blameless in the tensions that we've seen escalating over the past few months.
Right. I think so much has happened in the last few months since the coronavirus pandemic really kicked in. It seems like things are escalating really quickly, but in a somewhat uncontrolled way, or in a way that's more aggressive than what we've seen before. So, think of all the things that have happened. The tit-for-tat expulsions and regulations on foreign correspondence, the rhetorical battles with the U.S. trying to get multilateral groups to blame China for the coronavirus, the tensions in the South China Sea, the sanctions that you mentioned, the battles over Huawei and 5G. It seems like there are a lot of different fronts right now. I was reading this article on the Council on Foreign Relations site written by Kurt M. Campbell and Mira Rapp-Hooper, which was actually written before this consulate shut down. But basically, they argued that since the coronavirus pandemic began, China is unleashing, quote, an unprecedented diplomatic offensive on virtually every foreign policy front that might signal a deeper foreign policy rethink and a shift toward an assertive and less image-conscious China. Basically that in the past, when tensions rise up like this, China was more apt to kind of de-escalate or shift rhetoric a bit to kind of not necessarily to back down or reverse course, but to just try to maintain a more even keel in its relations with other countries. And now it seems that China's foreign policy is becoming ever more aggressive.
Both of those are really good points. It's hard to sort of take stock when everything's happening so fast and furious, but even just the language that the U.S. in particular is using, but both sides really, is such a sharp contrast to what used to be the case before. And as you said, in January, it was the phase one trade deal that Trump was really walking on eggshells to try to secure in terms of the kind of rhetoric that was used with regard to any of the things that are being condemned now. I mean, there was not a word about Xinjiang, for instance, a real lip service to pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, a real effort to avoid pushing any of China's hot buttons, really. And now, just 6 months later, the language that's being used and the steps that are being taken would have been unimaginable. And you're right that China in the past didn't necessarily back down and was assertive and provocative, but in general preferred to not be the bad guy in the global public opinion arena. And tended to, in the UN Security Council, for instance, piggyback on Russian obstructionism rather than spar directly with the U.S. We saw that that's no longer the case. The UN Security Council has been paralyzed now by U.S. China tensions rather than U.S. Russia tensions. And as you said, Prachi, the kind of language that Chinese diplomats around the world are using, not just with regard to the U.S., but with regard to European countries as well, is really unprecedented. And so that idea that it's not really being well controlled on one hand, and Elliot, that on the other, that there will be repercussions and retaliations, it makes you wonder where on the escalation ladder both sides are willing to try to freeze this, or whether there's a real risk of it deteriorating to the point where I saw a mention on Twitter yesterday, and it was somewhat tongue in cheek, but not fully tongue in cheek. The idea is it possible that diplomatic relations will be severed between the world's two biggest powers?
I don't know. I actually have a slightly different take than the two of you. I don't really recognize this China that, as you said, Judah, doesn't want to be the bad guy on the world stage, or as you said, Prachi, wants to keep an even keel in relations with other countries. To me, that China is pre-Xi Jinping, right? But after Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, we've pretty much consistently seen an escalatory, aggressive, belligerent string of policies from Beijing, and that applies to just about any hotspot in the world that you can choose. I think that trend has been of a piece since before the coronavirus pandemic, maybe with the exception of Hong Kong. Hong Kong seems to be a place where China is really escalating its efforts to tighten its grip there, probably because it senses an opportunity given the coronavirus pandemic. But otherwise, I see all of the things that China has been doing over the past 6 months as things that it's been doing consistently and will probably keep doing, because it sees that by now it's gained a level of economic clout in the world and also diplomatic clout to the point where it doesn't really face meaningful pushback in multilateral institutions or bilaterally from many countries, really besides the U.S. And I mean, even before this, the Obama administration was fairly reluctant to criticize China, even on its sweeping legal claims in the South China Sea. So, I mean, and returning back to this issue of the consulate closing, a lot of the things that the Trump administration cited as problematic Chinese behavior, things like trying to steal research and sensitive information from academic institutions, bullying Chinese citizens in the U.S. that the Chinese government has deemed as fugitives, trying to recruit professors and people in the area who might have access to sensitive information to spy for them. These are pretty par for the course in terms of what China has been doing. That's not to say they're excusable, certainly bad behavior, but it certainly doesn't warrant the kind of escalation of closing a diplomatic facility, which is something neither side has done since the two countries established diplomatic relations.
It's a fair point in terms of the substance of China's assertiveness, its outward-facing foreign policy. I guess I'd have to really look much more closely at the kind of readouts and the kind of statements and the kind of declarations that the foreign ministry and Chinese diplomats have made over the past 5 years or so. My sense, though, is that in general, China was engaging in what they call salami slicing tactics, really just trying to change facts on the ground, but avoiding the diplomatic spotlight of really high-profile rhetorical disputes and this kind of tit-for-tat move in terms of closing consulates or well, to be fair, the Chinese did put restrictions and remove visas for journalists working in China and things of that nature. But at the same time, I get the sense that there's a little more willingness to not necessarily play for the global audience in terms of trying to promote an image, even rhetorically, of a mild-mannered China, even if the behavior hasn't shifted that dramatically and changed that dramatically. But having said that, I think also while China isn't blameless, I think that the Trump administration and the real shift, even in the beginning of the Trump administration and now, with a little parenthesis around the period of negotiating the trade deal, might have made China, I think it definitely knocked China off balance in terms of what it's used to from the United States, but might have made them reconsider whether it's worth trying to paper over differences or pretend that the kind of objections that are being raised don't exist, and just be a little more willing to join the fray in terms of rhetoric. One of the things that, and I remember we talked about this on a previous podcast episode, Prachi, we've seen in terms of the Trump administration's discourse and rhetoric, a big emphasis now on human rights, whether in Hong Kong, in Xinjiang, in Tibet, and in addition to the kinds of objections that they lodged with regard to the consulate, and we had talked about this I think a month or two ago, about how now that the tensions are out in the open and the trade deal is in the past, we might see a lot more use of the human rights angle by the U.S. to try to paint China as a bad actor, not without reason. But I'm not sure. What do you make of that? Is it cynical, or is it it's certainly accurate, but is it cynical, or can it be effective?
Well, first, just to respond to what Elliot said, because I think, Elliot, that was a really good point. From what I've read, it seems like in the past, China might have had an incident like this where it was quite aggressive, but then backed off or taken their foot off the gas. Whereas now, so many of these incidents are stacking up back to back, that is part of why it feels like things are escalating. But in terms of human rights, yeah, I don't know if this will... Well, first of all, I think that the human rights criticisms of China are really justified, as you said, but I don't know if this will necessarily lead to positive pressure that will force China to improve rights conditions. I don't know what incentive China necessarily has to reduce some of its... to reverse course on some of the human rights violations. If anything, it seems like, particularly with Xinjiang and Hong Kong, they're just becoming more and more aggressive in limiting democratic rights in Hong Kong, and even implementing sterilization programs and things like that in Xinjiang. Some have mentioned that this consulate closure was basically an attempt for the Trump administration to look tough on China going into an election cycle. But even if Biden wins, he seems like he's going to continue that course, maybe to a lesser extent, but still being quite tough on China. So I wonder what this future will look like. It seems unlikely that these tensions will go away after the election, which is what some might think. If he's just doing this to win the election, then maybe some of that tension would dissipate, but that doesn't seem likely to me.
It's the sort of confrontation that's very hard to back away from without losing face and therefore leverage. Even if it's a confrontation that, for instance, as you mentioned, if Joe Biden wins the election in November, he inherits, still just unconditionally walking it back risks weakening the U.S. position with regard to China. All right. I imagine there's going to be more developments, and that we'll maybe be talking about the latest ones come September. In the meantime, hopefully cooler heads will prevail because, Elliot, as you mentioned, there are potential implications and repercussions that could get out of hand and out of control, as both of you mentioned, actually. All right, time to flag some WPR articles for everyone listening. Elliot, which one did you have in mind?
A briefing by Robert Mogilnicki about China's expanding influence in the Arab Gulf states. Robert points out that China's influence in that region is expanding in a pretty quiet way through increased consumption of oil and gas exports from the region, Beijing's investments in state-owned or state-affiliated entities, and its technology companies' expansion efforts into the Gulf. And those companies are well positioned to appeal to the region's large social media savvy youth population. And those things might not get as much attention as foreign direct investment and the kinds of big infrastructure projects that China finances in other parts of the world, but they still play an important role in facilitating Chinese influence in the region.
All right. And Prachi, which one did you have in mind?
This week's feature by Taylor Dibbert, which puts next month's parliamentary elections in Sri Lanka into context. So he reviews the history of Sri Lanka's civil war and the lasting ethnic tension from it, and also Sri Lanka's struggles with maintaining its democracy. He explains that if the coalition supported by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa wins a majority of seats, there will be virtually no check on his power. And if that happens, Taylor writes, the Rajapaksas are likely to use that vast political power to dismantle Sri Lanka's institutions, rework the constitution, and perpetuate a hardline nationalist agenda. With the Rajapaksas back in charge, disparaging transitional justice efforts and encouraging political, ethnic, and religious tensions, Sri Lanka won't be able to build a durable peace.
And I'll mention Candice Rondo's column this week about the covert CIA campaign of offensive cyber attacks, which we discussed on the podcast last week. Candice mentions the valid concerns over the legality of the attacks, as well as the dangerous precedents they may set in terms of norms of behavior in cyberspace. But she then takes a close look at the details of the attacks that we know something about and argues that they might be a judicious use of the new authorization granted to the agency rather than an abuse. As she writes, quote, it still pays to be skeptical of CIA actions and White House intent, and greater transparency and oversight of the program, at least within the executive branch, might be desirable. But paying attention to the details matters when it comes to assessing the wider practical and strategic implications of this covert CIA-led offensive cyber campaign for the future of cyber warfare, unquote. All right, before we get to the Who Said That segment, just a quick reminder that if you'd like to stay up to date on everything we cover at WPR, go ahead and sign up for our free daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. All right, time for Who Said That? Elliot, why don't you kick things off?
All right, so this one, you're probably not going to get who it was, but let's see if the person being referenced or the place comes to mind. This appointment is not simply trolling on the part of the bald one. It is an act of humiliation.
The bald one. I like that.
Who's a bald leader? Nothing comes to mind for me right now. I'm sure it will as soon as you say, but I've got no idea. Prachi?
Is it about Putin? I don't know if... Does he count as bald?
Apparently he does, yes. It is about Putin. That is a quote from a Russian activist named Olga Bulgakova, who was writing on Facebook in reference to Putin's decision to replace a very popular governor in the Khabarovsk region in the Far East. That decision set off pretty large protests that are still continuing.
All right. I'd say he's balding. But
we're biased, Gita.
I might be a little biased. Yeah, you're right. Prachi, what do you got for us?
Okay, so you can tell me who this is about. He is not really working this anymore. He doesn't want to be distracted by it. He's not calling and asking about data. He's not worried about cases. I'm
pretty sure I know who that's about. Elliot?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to blank.
It's not the bald one. It's the orange one.
Yes.
Oh, is it about Trump?
Yeah, this is an advisor talking about Trump in a Washington Post article about Trump's skepticism for public health expertise.
Right. I should have known that.
All right. And here's mine. Extra points if you get who said it, but the correct answer could be what it's about. Here's the quote. We are not here because we are going to be visitors at each other's birthday party later. We're here because we do business for our own country. We're all pros.
Yeah, I think this was Mark Rutte.
Yeah, it sounds like something that someone said at the EU budget talks, no?
Prachi gets the points. It's Mark Rutte about the EU Leaders Summit. He said that on the third night, I believe, when the negotiations turned bitter and went very late with no deal. And then on the fourth day, they announced the breakthrough. But the Dutch are known to be pretty direct, and apparently Ruta drove a pretty tough bargain. All right, great stuff. Thanks, Elliot.
Thanks.
Thanks, Prachi.
Thanks, Judah.
If you'd like to stay up to date on everything we cover at WPR, go ahead and sign up for our daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. In addition to free access to selected WPR articles all week long, you'll also get a promotional code for a 25% discount on a WPR subscription. And if you'd like to send comments or questions, email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and World Politics Review on Twitter, and you can find links to pieces covering the issues we talked about in the show notes on worldpoliticsreview.com. Have a great weekend, and see you next week for another episode of Trendlines.